Guys, BHVR have released the results of the MMR tests that they did over March and April. So if you were wondering what all the different tests were and how they affected your games, we now actually have information that shows everything that they did and what's going to be changing about skill-based matchmaking in the future. They released this long post to their website, and honestly, it took me quite some time to read through this to really understand the implications of all the changes. So what I would love to do for you is paraphrase everything so we have a better understanding of what happened and what's changing in the future. So first of all, let's go over some of the terms that they use in this. First up is maximum range. This is the range that a matchmaker can expand once you've been searching for too long. So basically, it takes 5 minutes before a matchmaker decides to expand, and it will expand to a maximum range of 500 points as it currently works. And so BHVR adjusted these variables to see how that would affect matchmaking. The second is the way that they actually match players. They use something called unidirectional matchmaking, and BHVR tried something called bilateral matchmaking for this test. So there's a little graph here, and basically this graph here explains how bilateral matchmaking would work. So player A is more skilled than player B, and they've been waiting for longer, so their matchmaking has expanded further, but player B hasn't searched for very long. Since player B hasn't expanded their matchmaking to reach player A, they would be matched. But you can see in example 2, player B has now waited long enough for their matchmaking to expand. Because of that, they're now within player A's skill rating via the expansion, and under bilateral matchmaking, they can now match with each other. And all you have to understand is under the current matchmaking system, that was never the case. Player A and player B would always be able to match with each other if player A waited long enough. So BHVR were trialing this new system to try and make fairer games. So let's kick things off with day 1's test. And all they did was change it so the expansion time started increasing after 1 minute rather than 5 minutes of waiting. So this meant that there were faster matches, especially during off time. However, because the expansion started quicker, the quality of matches were lowered. BHVR basically found that the kill rates changed a lot at high MMR and low MMR, with high-rated killers becoming more deadly and low-rated killers struggling. So that was the results of that test. Day number 2 decreased the maximum range that the MMR could increase its search for. And so because of this, they found that queue times took much longer because low-rated and high-rated players took longer to find a match. Their matches were slower, and actually the quality of matches were higher in general based on that. Day number 3 introduced this bidirectional matchmaking that they were testing. And what they expected to happen was that it would be more fair matchmaking, but high-end and low-end players would wait for longer. It took 15 minutes for some of these players to find matches. So BHVR had to change it so that if you had waited for 5 minutes using bidirectional matchmaking, then it switched back to uni. Bidirectional matchmaking didn't work very well, and BHVR had to abandon this test halfway through. Although, as a result, because the matches were far more fairer, what they found was lots of people dropped rating, and actually the average MMR rating dropped by 1/3. So that's quite a big difference. Day 4 essentially combined day 1 and day 2's tests. So the maximum range was decreased to 250 and the expansion time was decreased down to 1 minute. And what this did was basically drop survivor queue times across the board. However, in terms of kill rates, the games dropped to about 50% kill rates. And also what happened was that the games felt more samey. Strong survivor perks, strong killers, everything very meta, and an overall large rating drop for killers. Day 4 combined everything that they've been testing so far. So they essentially dropped the maximum range increase to 350, the expansion time to 1 minute, and then enabled bidirectional matchmaking. What they found was survivor queues were faster across the board. Killers' kill rates didn't decrease as much as the previous test. This is probably due to the fact that the maximum range wasn't as severely decreased, and the bidirectional matchmaking made it so that you didn't get crazy amount of players coming into your games when you didn't deserve to have those players who are much more skillful than you. Day 7 was actually exactly the same as the previous test, but all they did was turn off the grades in the post-game lobby. And what they found was the effect of changing it so that you could no longer see the grades of your opponents actually made people way more positive about this test. And because of that, they actually got the most positive feedback from this test overall. And then days 11 and 12, the 2 days they added on, were actually just to switch back to grade-based matchmaking. And on the first test, they hid the grades, and on the second test, they showed the grades. And overall, what they found was this had the most variety in matches. lots of different killers, lots of different perks, but it made a huge divide between high skill players that didn't need to try very hard to do well and low skill players who were trying their best in their games but getting nowhere. One thing that's really important to note is that the grade-based matchmaking tests were done on April 11th and 12th, which is just a day before grades were actually reset. And if you guys remember old matchmaking, rank-based matchmaking, the days before a rank reset were honestly some of the most wild games because everyone had inflated grades, so they were always towards red ranks, and it made matchmaking really random. So it's a shame that Behavior didn't have the foresight to actually test grade-based matchmaking and added it on last minute, because doing it on the 11th and 12th has really hurt their data. Basically equals almost random matchmaking rather than grade-based matchmaking. They would have been better waiting until April the 13th or doing it earlier in the tests. And it actually explains why during the test I thought this was random matchmaking, because it just didn't feel like there was any rhyme or rhythm to how people were matched. And that makes a lot of sense because everyone had inflated grades due to it being the end of the rank month. So basically what Behavior realized is they have to make a system that caters both to high skill players who want lots of variety in their matches, more variety in survivor perks, more variety in killer perks, more varieties in which killers they can actually play and play against, whilst also catering to the lower to mid-skilled players who want to have a fun, engaging game, but don't want to get stomped by players who are much better than them. So Behavior said they're going to do a couple things. They're going to reduce the maximum range of MMR so that you match with people who are closer to your skill rating, whilst also reducing the expansion time proportionally so that's not faster or slower than it was before. They're going to remove grades from the post-match screen so you never know what grade someone was. This is because grades aren't used in matchmaking and people often use grades to try and figure out whether or not someone is good at the game or not, when realistically it just shows how long they played the game that month. And they're going to do something that they didn't test for, which is very surprising, and that's lowering the effective skill rating that you can be matched for. If you don't know, MMR has a thing called a soft cap, and what this does is matches you with people who are much higher rating than you are. You can basically increase your MMR indefinitely, but you'll always get matched at the soft cap once you reach it. So let's say theoretically the soft cap currently is 1900. That means that a player who is rated at 1900 can match with a player who is rated at 3000 because they're both getting matched at that soft cap. And this is why a lot of people often say that MMR is a hoax. It doesn't exist because the soft cap essentially nullifies really high skilled players with, I guess, mid-skilled players who may have reached that cap. So Behavior have actually decided that they want to lower that skill cap so that high-skilled players will potentially get matched with more mid-skilled players, providing a bit more variety in their matches. I suppose Behavior are basically saying that mid-skilled players are less likely just to quit because they have a bad game, whereas low-rated players are more likely newer to the game, and their bad experiences are going to quickly decide whether or not they want to play the game for longer or not. Oh, and if you watched that disastrous January Q&A stream, then you may remember Behavior said that they wanted to make it so that survivor ratings were more team-based rather than solo-based, basically getting rid of escapes equals skills as a matchmaking rating. So that's positive, but unfortunately, we don't know when that's going to come. What I find really interesting is my actual feelings and thoughts during the tests, and now comparing them to the data that we currently have. I didn't play days 1 and 2, so I can't really comment on those. But day 3 didn't really feel like there was a change to matchmaking. So what I said to my viewers was actually it might be a placebo day. And that was the day that bilateral matchmaking was enabled and then swiftly turned off after 5 minutes. So it makes sense that I thought that was a placebo day because it really didn't affect the way that people were matched together. Day 4 I thought was also very similar to a no change or maybe even more stricter MMR. And that makes sense because we had 250 range decrease as well as the expansion time increase. So actually what happened was you went up against more people who are more like your skill rating. So it wasn't really a change as much as it felt stricter. And that didn't feel good, and I didn't like that day at all. Day 4 and 5, I definitely felt that I wasn't playing against people of my skill rating. And honestly, it was the days I had the most fun because whilst not every game was against players that I should be matched with, every now and again, I got players that were relatively good. So it felt like I had a lot of variety. You know, I could play weaker killers with weaker builds, but I might still go up against a team that is capable of running my killer. So I never knew what I was going to get. And I really enjoyed those tests. And days 11 and 12 were grade-based matchmaking. And honestly, I don't know how I felt about those. Yeah, huge variety. I could honestly get away with whatever I wanted on killer because it didn't matter what I brought. I was most likely going to win just through my macro game alone. Most people found that those days were the most fun for them, but I felt like as a high skill player, I actually didn't enjoy the fact that most of my games were just complete stomps. I wanted a little bit of resistance against my killer, and every now and again, I wanted a team that could actually beat me, because then things just get too easy. So I find it really interesting that the days that I enjoyed were days 5 and 6, and that's basically what behavior are going to be doing with their changes. That seems positive moving forward. Let me know what you guys thought about the matchmaking tests. Were there a particular day that you enjoyed and now you know what they did? Are you happy with the changes? I actually uploaded an hour-long video on one of the days that I enjoyed the most, and it's going to be the most close to the new changes coming to skill-based matchmaking. So if you would like to see what that's like, then click this video here.